Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another Film Fanatic show. Hope everyone's doing good. It is Wednesday morning at about 10:24. Pretty normal winter day or winter morning. Cold as hell, but not quite as cold as it's been. Yeah. I've been working my way. I have about trying to think. There's about every. I mean, one of the things that I try to really do with this show, with the Film Fanatic channel, this channel, is when I'm covering movies and doing shows on these movies, most of the, pretty much all of the movies I talk about, and all of the videos, all of the movies I talk about are all movies that are in my own personal collection. I don't usually really do, maybe like if there was a situation, which is, obviously happened many times, but if I watch a movie in passing, maybe say it's a movie that I saw years ago, but I haven't seen it in years, but I remember really liking it, and I don't own it. I typically won't do a show on it that way. I will usually just cover movies that are in my collection. I mean, I do, and obviously I make exceptions. Like I do, I always review. I always do videos on movies that I see in a theater, and I try to keep movies, the reviews of these films pretty positive. But I think it's good to be able to talk about the pros and cons of a film. What, and again, it's all subjective, but what I feel for me works, or for what ultimately, I why I thought that film was a failure. I think it's good to kind of analyze both sides, because if you're giving, you know, um, a talk, or even if there's a respect like a really respectable debate about it that happens, you can give points on both sides, and it's good to understand the other side's view of things. And I think it's a really healthy exercise. I mean, at least I find it's a real healthy exercise to, when you're really into film like I am, looking at a film and seeing those things that you feel really make it work, and then vice versa. Seeing those things that you really that you felt really caused the film to be to not work, or not to be effective, or to be a disaster. So I think it's good to like look at both things, and to be able to try to gain a way of expressing that. So that's one of the reasons I do that. But I still try to stay away from negative reviews. I pretty much only talk about movies that I really love. But again, I think it's good to have the other side of things. And I do, when I go to the movies, I will do a show on that movie, whether it's been a great experience or not a great experience. So I always talk about that, because going to the movies for me is one of the most enjoyable things that I do in my free time, if not the most enjoyable thing. It's interesting too, because a friend of mine, a really good friend, who is a movie buddy of mine, is having a birthday party tomorrow night, and she actually rented out a movie theater, and she's going to be showing her favorite anime of all time. I can't remember the title of that movie offhand, but I have definitely not seen it, so it'll be my first time. And I think it's an awesome and kind of a unique idea for a birthday party. She's really into movies too, and really into anime, as I am too. She's more, I guess, into more modern anime, I guess, if you want to call it. Like she stays up on a lot more anime films that have come out in the last 5 or 10 years. Me, I'm kind of like I'm kind of on the fence a little bit about that. I'm a huge anime fan, but I've been pretty lackluster as far as staying up on new anime. A lot of new anime I haven't been all that impressed with in recent years, but I'm looking forward to seeing this movie, and I will do a show about it probably Friday morning. So stay tuned for that. And then I always one of the things I always do is, and I look at it as a way for me to kind of prep myself for the video that I'm going to do, is every show that I do on this channel, I've gotten in the habit this past year where I will watch the movie the night before, and then that following morning is when I will do the review. Even if it's a movie I've seen 10,000 times. Like for instance, if I wanted to say do a review of The Godfather tomorrow, I would, even though I've seen that movie and it's my favorite movie of all time, and I've seen it 2 billion times. If I had this idea that, okay, I want to review that movie again tomorrow, Thursday morning, and I want to talk about it, maybe from a different angle, I will go ahead and sit down and watch it tonight. And I do that just because it's still fresh in my head, and I can still, it helps me process maybe some points I want to bring up, and I think movies for me always grow with time, and I believe in that age old saying, like fine wine, things, the age of things sometimes makes something stronger, or it gives it more power and poignancies, and it makes it more potent. So I definitely believe that, and for me, it ages the process of watching film and just art in general, music or whatever it is, books, things things that I really love seem to really age and grow, and it can a lot of times mean a different experience for me. And so one of the things too I have about, there's a handful of movies, but it's getting pretty low right now. There's like maybe two movies I can think of after this show, of some movies that I haven't reviewed for this channel, and I will definitely do shows about them in the next week or two. And today's show is the last movie that in my list. I had a pretty big stack of movies in the last few weeks. I went to Bull Moose about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I had not gone there in a while. And I also had gone to Goodwill in Rockland, which is an awesome spot for buying Blu-rays. I still buy DVDs here and there, but I try not to. But I still do here and there, but mainly I try to just buy Blu-rays. And today's show is the last movie of that haul. It took me a while to get it all kind of organized and to finally sit and watch all these films. So this is today's show is on a movie that I literally had not seen in probably since I was a kid. This was a movie that my dad always loved. And so I remember always seeing it on cable back in the days of the 80s and in the 90s. This was always one of my favorite dad movies. Some of his favorite films were like The Day the Earth Stood Still. That was one I always watched when I was a kid. Another movie was Giant, James Dean, and a handful of westerns. The Unforgiven by Clint Eastwood, Shane, another western, and this movie right here, 1967's The Dirty Dozen. And I picked this up on my last trip to Goodwill, and I was super excited to get this on Blu-ray. It was super cheap, like $2. Perfect condition. and it came with a shit ton of special features, which again I've always talked about. For me, buying a Blu-ray, that will a lot of the times be the determining factor if I'm going to buy it or not, because I'm a big film nerd, and I'm the same way today. If I get into a band or film or whatever, and I really love it, I will really want to find as much info about how it was created, what inspired that work of art. That's you know how I am just automatically as being a fan. And so this was I got this really really cheap. I have not seen the Dirty Dozen in many many years, and I remember this movie being it's an American classic, but I had not seen it in since I was a kid, which is crazy. And I was super excited to get it on Blu-ray for super cheap, and it had a bunch of special features. And I watched this last night, and again, this has been a movie that I have not seen in since I was probably 9 or 10 years old. And this movie is, I have to say, this is one of the most badass action movies ever made. It's a long movie too. I didn't realize it was funny because I started watching it around you know a little bit or so after 9 o'clock last night, which was Tuesday night, and so I started watching it, and then I ended up like having to take a little pause to like make some dinner and a couple other things, and then I had a phone call. I had to make this phone call, so I was on the phone for a little bit, and then I fired it back up. I had hit pause, and I was loving it, and then I looked at the time for this film, and it was like two. This film is 2.5 hours long, and I was like, holy shit. And it was getting late, and I was like, man, I don't know if I'm gonna be able to get through this entire film, but I really want to watch it. And then but I was starting to get a little bit tired, and then I was like, this movie fucking rocks. And then I watched it to the end, and then I was just like, yep, this movie is just incredible. I mean, it's got one of the most amazing casts ever. Getting back to the length of the film, that's a complaint, where you hear a lot these days of the length of films. A lot of films are pretty long, and I think a lot of films are, I don't know, maybe to a degree, a little bit. The runtime can maybe be a little bit too much, but I don't know. It's a funny thing because this came out in '67, which is insane to me, considering how incredible this movie is and how it's dated obviously, but dated for the right reasons, like in a cool way. But it feels like the action sequences in this movie are just spectacular, and it's like it's once things get going, it's full on, and it felt like so timeless watching this movie. But this came out of a period of Hollywood, like those movies I mentioned before, American classics, movies like On the Waterfront. Those films were like, at the pinnacle of like the 60s and 70s, kind of the golden era of Hollywood in a lot of ways for me. And when you look at those films, and then when you look at the length of those films, they were typically 2.5 hours long. A lot of those films were like kind of sweeping epics. You look at a lot of the. I'm a huge Western fan and a huge John Ford fan. And if you look at a lot of the length of those films, they were 2.5. They were clocking in at 2.5 hours. Most of those films, and I don't think it was ever a thing of where people bitched and moaned and complained about the length of the film. That was during the time of when people would go to the cinema with their entire family and have a big outing, plan a whole day around it, and it was an experience. Very, very different time now. So I don't know, and then we're also in the age of where people will binge watch movies, and watch hours, copious amounts of hours of content, you know, and so I don't get that. And then I hear, but then I also hear, well, to make that analogy isn't fair because if you're home watching a TV show or a movie and you're, quote unquote binge watching, where you're going to watch numerous, back to back episodes or a couple of movies back to back, you are, in the confines of your own home. You can hit pause, you can do other things, and then come back to it, take a pee break or whatever. So it's a different thing. It's not like you're paying for a ticket and you have to stay there, in the seat. You don't have that luxury of doing all these other things. I get that, but I still feel that overall, I would say for me, overall, the criticism of the length of movies is kind of a new thing. Yeah, there are movies that I can think of that are probably a little too long, but, you know, again, going back to this period in Hollywood and these kinds of films, the length time was pretty significant, and it's a new thing. And I think there's a sense of with people that there's a little bit of entitlement around people, around things and their time and their money and all these things. And people want things quick and fast. They don't have really the patience for a lot of things. So I think that's a bigger factor as to why people bitch and complain about it. But that being said, this film is 2.5 hours long, and in all honesty, again, I had to like break it up because I had to pause it for a little bit of time, maybe a half hour, but not much. It freaking flew by. It flew by. I never ever like looked at my watch or the time and been like, okay, maybe it's time to wrap this film up. I never did that once. It felt like the movie moved so quickly. It felt like the movie was under 2 hours. And it never dragged. Not once, for me at least. I've often said too, like where you can have a film, well, like Copland, for instance, I think it's a perfect example. On paper, that movie should be a masterpiece because of the cast. I mean, you have Ray Liotta, Harvey Keitel, Robert De Niro, Sylvester Stallone. I mean, just an incredible cast. But the film is kind of a dud. It's kind of like Michael Rappaport's in it too. It kind of like once it gets to like the second act, the film just gets so kind of lazy and predictable, and it feels rushed. And it's one of those things like on paper, Copland, and I've talked about that movie. I did 2 different shows on that movie. I sort of like that movie. I like that director James Marigold quite a bit. He's made some really great films. But and it was his first film, and I have it on DVD, and then I got a Blu-ray copy of it, and I always had a mixed thing with that film. I thought it was good, but there were certain things around the story that I felt were just went off the tracks, and it was heavy-handed in a way of where things felt forced and not natural. And it's a cop drama. It's a pretty dark film, but on paper at your face value you'd be like this has got to be a total winner. But the script the script is not great, and it's kind of with what they did with the script. It's kind of poorly executed. And that movie is so underwhelming, and it could have been great. So I've talked about that a lot. Like you can assemble an all-star cast and put them in a movie, or you can have that, for instance, in a musical context. But if the chemistry isn't there, and there isn't a good story, and it isn't really, and the direction isn't very good, but especially if there isn't that chemistry between the characters to bring the script to life, the movie is not going to be very good. It's just going to be either mediocre or it's going to be a failure. Not the case with The Dirty Dozen. I mean, you have one of the most. It's kind of like the Avengers of a cast of actors, especially during that time. I mean, just legendary actors all assembled in this film. And the script is just absolutely fantastic. It's a really like the first half of the film is kind of, you're introduced to all of these characters. You're getting a background on each person, each character, and you're seeing how like they all really resonate with each other, how they get along, and there's this automatic like magic chemistry that just connects you to these characters. And the first half of the film is basically just really getting to know these guys who become the Dirty Dozen. And the whole premise of this movie is the military assembles these convicts to go in and kill a whole shitload of Nazis, basically. And the whole group is organized, and Lee Marvin is in charge of all of these convicts. And then the second and third act of this film is just like balls to the wall violence and just Nazis getting killed left and right. And it's like the second and third acts of this film, especially the third act, is just so, it's like the definition of badass. I mean, talk about the action. The action sequences in this movie are just incredible. It's super satisfying. The body count is insane. Like, I forgot how violent this movie is, considering it came out in '67. Like, there is a shit ton of carnage in this movie. And, the action sequences themselves and kind of the choreography around it, the set design, the world building, if you will, is incredible. Like, and here we are, 2025, and it just still looks incredible. It looks timeless. And again, the cast: Lee Marvin, Charles Bronson, John Cassavetes, Telly Savalas, Ernest Borgnine, Donald Sutherland, Jim Brown, Chris Walker. I mean, George Kennedy. I mean, some of the best actors of their time, all assembled to play the Dirty Dozen. And what a payoff. I mean, this movie it's got to be one of the most badass movies ever made. It's thrilling. I love this movie. And again, I've said it many, many times, and it literally was that experience for me where seeing it on Blu-ray was like the first time watching this movie. And especially, I literally have not seen this movie since I was a kid. When I was a kid, I saw this movie quite a few times. Again, it was one of my dad's favorite movies, so he would always have it on. But my God, this movie is so timeless and just kicks ass in every way. It's got, again, it's uber violent. There is, it's all about killing and slaughtering Nazis, which is awesome. But this movie has a lot of humor. It's kind of funny. It's got like the first half. There's a lot of like kind of comedic elements, and there's like some different tones with that. And I love, and then it has obviously some very serious tones, especially when it gets into some of the backstories of some of the characters. But it's a great, kind of combination of those different tones and elements. But then it goes into action mode, and it's like full bore, like look the fuck out. But one of the most badass movies ever made. I can't recommend this movie enough. It's hard to believe. It's insane that this came out in 1967. I mean, just nuts. Just totally nuts. It was directed by Robert Aldridge. Robert Aldridge was a pretty prolific director. He directed Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, which is a masterpiece. Kiss Me Deadly. Veracruz, The Longest Yard. The Flight of the Phoenix. I mean, Apache. The Last Sunset. A lot of classics. A lot of movies I want to see again. And I have seen them, but again, these were movies I saw mostly when I was a kid. But I can't recommend this movie enough. This Dirty Dozen, one of the most badass movies ever made. You know, you have some of the most iconic actors in American film history all assembled in this movie. Yeah, so awesome. So thanks again, and we will see you next time. Peace.